So in this video, I'd like to discuss three teams that I think could have an identity or are starting to form one, but seem to be in limbo or seem to not really know what they want to do with themselves. And I'm going to avoid teams like the Timberwolves or the Lakers who already know that they're in full rebuild mode, or teams like the Nets who have basically no chance of finding an identity for the next couple years, or teams like the Knicks who are just goofy. So I'm going to talk about three specific teams that I think have pieces or could be able to form an identity. They just don't seem to exactly know what they want to do, and it's setting them back for multiple years. So let's get right into it. After trading Dwight Howard, the Magic just can't seem to figure out what exactly they want to do with their roster. They've acquired a lot of nice young pieces over the years, but they don't seem to really know what they want to do with them. They picked up Nikola Vucevic in a trade with the Sixers right after Howard left, and Vucevic has become a pretty good center for them. He's a good offensive center. He's a pretty good rebounder, average defender. He's a pretty nice piece for them. He's not the kind of player you build your team around, but he's a pretty nice player. They also got Tobias Harris from the Bucks in a trade and developed him nicely. He became a good scorer and rebounder at the 3/4. But then they decided to just trade him for no explicable reason to the Pistons for scraps. They could have gotten a lot more than what they did for him, and it didn't really make a whole lot of sense. They also drafted a really nice piece in 2013 in shooting guard Victor Oladipo, but in his first couple seasons, they played him out of position at point guard when he's more of a two guard, and he had a breakout season in his second season, averaging nearly 18 points per game. But then in his third season, for no good reason, they benched him, and then in his fourth season, they traded him. They also had a nice young piece in Aaron Gordon, who they took in 2014 in the first round, who was starting to look like a pretty dynamic player at the four position. He looked like he was starting to become a stretch four. He was becoming a matchup nightmare for power forwards and other bigger guys. But then they traded Oladipo, who was one of their only good guards at the time, for another four and created a complete logjam when they picked up Serge Ibaka in that trade. They also signed center Bismack Biyombo to a major contract, which didn't make a whole lot of sense because Biyombo is throughout Biyombo's career, he's never shown any ability to have any sort of offensive game. He's about an average rebounder, and he's a good defender, but he's not worth the money that they paid him, and he's not worth the logjam that he's created. Commit to a rebuild. They need to flip both Vucevic and shooting guard Evan Fournier for assets. Both of those guys could be sent to contending teams and would be nice pieces for contending teams, and they could most likely get back a few draft picks or a few younger players. They also have to figure out if their point guard, Elfrid Payton, is an actual starting caliber point guard before his contract expires in actually next season. He has shown the ability to be a good defender. He's a good distributor. He can drive to the rim, but he's not a great shooter, and he doesn't seem to have a whole lot of consistency. So they have to figure out what they have with him. They also have to give up on Mario Hezonja. Mario Hezonja, in just 2 seasons, has absolutely shown nothing. Mario Hezonja was taken ahead of other guys who were looking like better players than him. He was not a good draft pick from the beginning. He's a shooting guard who can't shoot. He can't play defense. He can't really do anything all that well. They need to give up on him. They should not exercise his team option for this upcoming season. If they already have, I'm not exactly sure, then they made a mistake. They need to scrap a lot of these guys and build around Aaron Gordon and first round pick this year, Jonathan Isaacs. They need to build around those two guys. Isaacs is a little bit thin right now, but if he puts on some bulk, he could probably be a 5. You have him at the 5 and Gordon at the 4. Nobody's going to be able to guard those guys. It's going to be really impossible to deal with that team. Now, I left Biyombo off the pieces that they should dump because I don't think anyone's going to take Biyombo's contract. Who in their right mind would take that big of a contract for a guy who is a defender and nothing else? But if they can manage to turn Vucevic and Fournier into assets, they can pull the plug early enough on Hezonja and figure out what they have in Payton and most likely end up pulling the plug on him too. They can set up their team for some good future rebuilding. And I think that in a couple years, if they build around Gordon and Isaacs, they could be a pretty good team in the East. A lot of people are going to hate on me for this one, but I think the Celtics need to figure out exactly what they want to do. The Celtics have a very weird roster that has a lot of prospects, a lot of draft picks, and a couple stars as well, but they don't seem to really fit together in terms of building a team. At this point, I feel like the Celtics should be on an episode of Hoarders, and it should be called Hoarders Draft Pick and Prospect Edition, because They just have so many assets, and they don't seem to know what they want to do with any of them. They have a ton of wing players right now. They have, right off the bat, they have the last two high first round picks that they've gotten, Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, both playing at the 3. And then they have, obviously, Gordon Hayward, who they just signed to a max contract playing the 3. And then they just traded for Marcus Morris, who people are saying is going to play the 4. Marcus Morris has never been a good 4. He's a back in his best role, which is when he was with the Suns in 2013-2014. He's a backup 3. He's a good shooter. He's not an interior player. He's not a great rebounder. He's an average defender, but he's not a starting 4, and he's probably not a starting 3 either. They have a lot of wing guys. They have basically no depth at the center position. They have Al Horford, who's on a max contract. Horford is a guy who's not a great rebounder. He's not any sort of guy who will overpower somebody inside. He's a good shooter. He's a good offensive player. And he's an excellent passer, but he's not the kind of guy that you can expect to go out there and actually keep you competitive on the boards. They did just sign Aaron Baines as their backup center. Baines is an interesting type of guy. He's an energy center. He's a good rebounder, a pretty good defender. But they lost Kelly Olynyk and they lost Amir Johnson in free agency, both of whom were the other two main bigs on that roster. They also had to get rid of Avery Bradley, their starting shooting guard salary, to get Morris and to clear up space for Hayward. Bradley, most people don't realize this, Bradley was actually their second leading rebounder and their second leading scorer last season. So you're losing points, but you're also losing rebounding. He was also an absolutely elite defender. He was a lockdown defender at the 2. So when you lose all that defense, you lose your second leading rebounder, and you lose a good shooter and player like that, that hurts your team. And I forgot to mention they also have Jay Crowder at the wing position. And people are saying stuff like, you can put Jaylen Brown at the 2, you can put Jay Crowder at the 4. All 4 of their main wing guys, and I guess 5 if you include Marcus Morris, all 5 of those guys would be best suited at the 3. None of them would help the team as much at the 2 or 4 as they would at the 3. So you've got 5 guys who specialize in the 3. 4 of them actually have very good value. So I just don't understand what the Celtics are doing with these wing guys. They also have Isaiah Thomas's contract expiring this year, and Thomas has already stated that he wants the max money. And I don't blame him. He puts up a lot of points. He's never really gotten paid in the NBA. And somebody somewhere will give him a max contract. So the Celtics have to figure out if they're going to give him a max contract. They also have to figure out what to do with Horford's contract, because Horford is making a ton of money to really not be that kind of guy that's worth that much money. So the Celtics at this point look like they're loaded at the 3. They have a guy who they're not sure if they're going to pay at the 1, and they have a guy who's overpaid at the 5. So at this point, does Danny Ainge know exactly what he wants to do? Because everyone says he's a mad scientist. At this point, he's looking a little bit more like a madman. The solution for the Celtics, in my opinion, is actually pretty simple. Danny Ainge has to stop being stingy, has to stop being silly, has to stop being goofy with all these assets that he has, and actually flip a few of them for a guy like Anthony Davis. I think Anthony Davis could be the perfect trade target for the Celtics. The Pelicans know that they're going to lose Anthony Davis because he's already stated that he wants to win, and there's probably absolutely zero chance he goes back to the Pelicans. The Pelicans were able to get DeMarcus Cousins for a couple prospects, or just one prospect actually, in Buddy Hield. The Pelicans at this point don't look like they have much of a future. They don't have a lot of young guys that they can develop. They don't have any extra draft picks or anything like that. I think if the Celtics could stop being stingy with their assets and offer them Jaylen Brown, Marcus Smart, and maybe the Nets 2018 draft pick, they might also be able to package Al Horford in there and get Anthony Davis. I think the Pelicans will look at that and see Jaylen Brown has a lot of potential. The Nets pick could possibly be the number 1 overall pick, and you're also getting a pretty good player in Marcus Smart, a good defensive point guard, a good facilitator. And at that point, it doesn't really matter if you're taking on Horford's contract, because Horford would only have 2 more years left on his contract at that point. So I think the Pelicans, in some sort of way like that, would be willing to do that kind of trade. They also cannot give Isaiah the max contract. Now, I like Isaiah Thomas. I love the guy as a person. I love his heart. I love the way he plays. I love how he plays with a chip on his shoulder. And I think he's a very good basketball player. I don't think he's worth a max contract. I think he's an elite scorer, but he doesn't offer a ton of facilitating. He's a ball-dominant point guard, and he is a complete liability on defense. And in this day and age, the teams that win the most are teams that have guys as the forefront that can play defense and offense. Steph Curry's an underrated defender. He's not a great defender, but he's an underrated defender. And right next to him, you've got Klay Thompson, who's a good defender, Kevin Durant, who's an underrated defender, and Draymond Green, who's a nice defender. LeBron James is also a terrific defender, and he's been dominating the league for years. You look at teams that have won, and they have stars that are being paid to play both ways. I don't think Isaiah will ever be that guy. Even if he really tries on defense, he just doesn't have the size or length or ability to be able to defend anyone at this point. And I think you give him a max contract, you're basically stuck with a guy who will doom your team to being a 50-55 win team and never get you in the finals. And I know this is an unpopular opinion, but when you face reality, he's not the kind of guy that you want to be the number one player on your team. So I don't think that they should give him the max contract. I think if they do that, they're pretty much dooming themselves for the future. So they need to stop being ridiculous in terms of their assets. I mean, I heard some sort of rumor that they could have gotten Paul George if they had thrown in Terry Rozier, who's their backup point guard, into the deal, and they didn't want to do that. I don't understand that kind of stuff. If Danny Ainge stops being stingy with his picks and starts actually using some of them to get a player like Anthony Davis, and also not paying Isaiah Thomas way too much money, I think they could compete with LeBron in way shorter than people even think they can. The Pistons at this point have become a fringe team that are usually winning about 40 to 45 games, or at least are expected to win anywhere between that. They've never been able to take it to the next step, but they also don't look like a team who's going to get any sort of high draft pick within the next couple of years. So at this point, they have to figure out whether to push forward or completely rebuild. So the first question they have to ask themselves is Drummond capable of being the team's best player? So far, it's questionable as to if he has shown that. They also have to figure out what they want to do with point guard Reggie Jackson. Reggie Jackson signed a nice deal a couple of years ago, and 2 years ago looked like a guy who they could actually have as one of their best players. He was a nice scorer. He did a decent job passing. He was a decent defender. He's a guy that they really liked at first, but after he got injured last season, they seemed to sort of already give up on him in a way. They gave him less minutes. They gave more minutes to their backup point guard, Ish Smith, who was more of a pass-first type of guy. So they have to figure out what they want to do with him. They also have to figure out whether or not they want to pull the plug on Stanley Johnson. Stanley Johnson was their first-round pick 2 years ago. Coming out of college, he looked like a nice scorer, but once he got onto an NBA court, it was clear he wasn't really in place. He's not a very smart guy. He doesn't have a high basketball IQ. He's not a great shooter. He's inefficient on offense, and he's not a great defender. So they have to figure out exactly what they want to do with him. They also just traded for Avery Bradley, who's a really nice pickup. He's a great defender. He can actually score. He's a nice shooter. And he's an underrated rebounder. He actually was second on the Celtics in rebounding, as I mentioned, in the Celtics section. So they have to figure out, are they going to offer him a bunch of money, or are they going to let him go after the season because his contract is expiring? So after struggling for probably a decade after the Wallace Billups, Rip Hamilton era, the Pistons have actually sort of become a competent team again. They've started to look like more of a playoff team. They have some good pieces. But at the end of the day, these pieces are not going to get them very far in the playoffs. They might not even get them to the playoffs. The Pistons have a lot of intriguing pieces. They have a lot of young guys. But they have to commit to a rebuild. And it's sad to say, because they just started to look better again, they have to commit to a rebuild at this point. And unfortunately, even though everyone loves Andre Drummond, and I like Andre Drummond, who doesn't like Andre Drummond? He's a really high energy guy. He's pretty entertaining to watch, especially on the offensive boards. But at the end of the day, Stan Van Gundy is putting him in the Dwight Howard role that Stan Van Gundy had for Dwight Howard when he was coaching Orlando. And as much as we all don't want to admit this, Andre Drummond is not Dwight Howard. Dwight Howard, at his peak, was an actually very skilled offensive center who was also an elite defender and rebounder. Andre Drummond is an elite rebounder, but he's an average defender, and his offensive game has seemed to plateau. And he's being paid $25 million per year at this point. I think they need to figure out if they can get any pieces for Reggie Jackson, who I mentioned earlier, Tobias Harris, who I mentioned in the Magic section, who's now the Pistons starting small forward. He looks like he could net them a few pieces. And if they could flip Drummond for a bunch of assets as well. These guys all still have trade value at this point, and they should use whatever they can in order to commit to this rebuild. They also need to completely give up on Stanley Johnson. Stanley Johnson is not going to ever develop. He regressed in his second season. I don't think he'll ever be a good player in the NBA. So if they can pick up prospects for these guys, if they can commit to a rebuild, then I think that they might have a chance in the future. But for right now, the roster that they have is going to keep them picking anywhere from 10 to 14 every year, or maybe 10 to 16. They're not going to get far in the playoffs if they even make the playoffs. They don't look like more than a 40 to 45 win team at most, and they might not even be that. If they can commit to a rebuild and get some assets for the value they still have on their roster, they might be able to compete in a couple of years. So in conclusion, indecisiveness is a major issue for a lot of teams in sports in general. But in the NBA, the problem with indecisiveness is that it can keep you from having a chance of winning a lottery and getting a high draft pick. Because if you're a team that doesn't necessarily know what it wants to do and you're content with being the 8th seed or almost making the playoffs every year, then you're probably going to be picking low enough where you're not going to get an elite guy. And you're also not going to be attracting any big name free agents because it doesn't look like you're going to be competing anytime soon. So then you see teams like the Pistons, who I mentioned, who are stuck in limbo at this point, or teams like the Magic, who seem to not exactly know what they want to do with themselves. Or you could be a team who commits to a complete rebuild but then never stops rebuilding, like the Celtics. So all three of these teams definitely need to figure out exactly what they're trying to do, and they need to be willing to take risks, move their pieces around, and actually try and come up with some sort of end goal. So thank you for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed it, and more content coming soon.